In the quiet corridors of the Arizona State Historical Museum, Dr. Catherine Wells had spent the better part of 15 years cataloging the photographic legacy of the American Southwest. As the museum's senior archivist specializing in territorial era documentation, she had examined countless portraits of lawmen, outlaws, and ordinary citizens who had shaped the frontier during its most turbulent decades. But on this sweltering August afternoon, as she carefully processed a recently donated collection from a deceased collector's estate, one particular photograph would shatter her understanding of historical documentation and challenge everything she believed about the nature of photographic truth. The image appeared to be a standard formal portrait from 1889, taken in what the accompanying documentation identified as Tombstone, Arizona Territory. The photograph showed a man in his mid-30s wearing the distinctive star badge of a territorial sheriff, posed in the rigid, formal manner typical of frontier photography. His weathered face bore the stern expression common to lawmen of that era, and his clothing suggested both authority and the practical needs of frontier law enforcement. Dr. Wells positioned the photograph under her examination lamp and began her standard archival process. The technical quality was exceptional for its time period, indicating the work of a skilled professional photographer rather than an itinerant picture taker. The composition was carefully arranged, with the subject positioned against a neutral backdrop that allowed every detail of his appearance to be clearly visible. As she began documenting the various elements visible in the photograph, Dr. Wells noted the typical accoutrements of a frontier sheriff. The subject wore a well-maintained uniform jacket with brass buttons, and his badge was prominently displayed on his chest. A gun belt was visible around his waist, though the weapon itself was partially obscured by the angle of his pose. Everything about the image suggested authenticity and historical accuracy, but as Dr. Wells continued her examination, her attention was drawn to something that made her pause in her work. Standing slightly behind and to the right of the sheriff was another figure, positioned in such a way that he appeared to be part of the formal portrait arrangement. This second man was dressed in the dark clothing typical of the period, and his presence in the photograph seemed entirely natural at first glance. However, something about the second figure troubled Dr. Wells in a way she couldn't immediately articulate. There was a quality to his appearance that seemed somehow different from the sheriff, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what was causing her unease. She reached for her high-powered magnifying glass and focused on the mysterious second figure. What she saw under magnification would haunt her for the rest of her career. While the sheriff showed all the normal characteristics of a photographic subject from that era, the second figure displayed anomalies that defied explanation. His clothing appeared to be from the correct time period, but it showed no signs of wear or weathering, despite the harsh conditions of frontier life. More disturbing still, while the sheriff cast a clear shadow on the backdrop behind him, the second figure appeared to cast no shadow at all. Dr. Wells set down her magnifying glass and rubbed her eyes, certain that the long hours of detailed archival work were playing tricks on her vision. But when she looked again, the anomalies remained exactly as she had first observed them. She reached for her digital microscope, a piece of modern equipment that could capture and enhance details far beyond what the human eye could perceive. As the high-resolution image appeared on her computer screen, Dr. Wells felt a chill that had nothing to do with the museum's air conditioning system. The second figure was undeniably present in the photograph, but the enhanced image revealed details that made his presence even more unsettling. His face, while clearly visible, seemed to possess an otherworldly quality that was difficult to describe, but impossible to ignore. Most unnaturally, the second figure appeared to be looking directly at the camera with an intensity that seemed to transcend the normal limitations of 19th-century photography. While the sheriff maintained the rigid, forward-facing pose typical of formal portraits from that era, the mysterious second figure appeared to be aware of being photographed in a way that suggested consciousness and intent. Dr. Wells saved the enhanced image and leaned back in her chair, trying to process what she was seeing. In her 15 years as a historical archivist, she had encountered numerous examples of early photographic anomalies. Double exposures, chemical stains, and processing errors could all create unusual effects that might be mistaken for supernatural phenomena. But this image was different. The second figure was too clearly defined, too deliberately positioned to be explained by simple photographic error. She decided to research the provenance of the photograph more thoroughly. According to the documentation that had accompanied the collection, the image had been part of an estate belonging to one Marcus Thornfield, a wealthy collector who had died the previous month at the age of 91. Thornfield had been known for his extensive collection of Western Americana, particularly photographs and documents related to law enforcement in the Arizona Territory. Dr. Wells accessed the museum's research databases and began searching for additional information about the photograph's history. She found records indicating that Thornfield had acquired the image at an estate sale in 1967, but the trail grew cold beyond that point. The original photographer was listed as unknown, which was not uncommon for frontier photography of that era. As she continued her research, Dr. Wells discovered something that made her pause. The sheriff in the photograph appeared to match the description of one Samuel Garrett, who had served as sheriff of Cochise County during the late 1880s. According to territorial records, Garrett had been a respected lawman who had brought order to one of the most lawless regions of the Arizona Territory. But Dr. Wells's research also revealed something far more intriguing. In the same records that documented Sheriff Garrett's service, she found references to his longtime adversary, a man named William Blackwood, who had been the leader of a notorious outlaw gang that had terrorized the region during the same period. According to newspaper accounts from the time, Blackwood and Garrett had engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse that had lasted for nearly 3 years. The conflict between the two men had reached its climax in March of 1887, when Sheriff Garrett had finally cornered Blackwood and his gang in a remote canyon outside of Tombstone. The confrontation had resulted in Blackwood's death, effectively ending the reign of terror that his gang had imposed on the territory. Garrett had been hailed as a hero, and his victory over Blackwood had secured his reputation as one of the most effective lawmen in the Southwest. Dr. Wells felt another chill as she read these historical accounts. If the sheriff in the photograph was indeed Samuel Garrett, and if the image had been taken in 1889 as the documentation suggested, then it had been captured 2 years after William Blackwood's death. Yet the second figure in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to the descriptions of Blackwood that she had found in the historical records. She decided to examine the photograph even more closely, using advanced digital enhancement techniques to extract every possible detail from the image. As she worked with the enhanced version, she began to notice other anomalies that she had initially missed. The lighting in the photograph was subtly inconsistent. While the sheriff was clearly illuminated by the photographer's lighting setup, the second figure seemed to be lit by a different light source entirely, one that cast shadows in directions that defied the physical arrangement of the photographic studio. More disturbing still, as Dr. Wells enhanced different sections of the image, she began to see details in the second figure's appearance that confirmed her growing suspicions. The man's clothing, while period-appropriate, showed characteristics that matched historical descriptions of William Blackwood's distinctive style of dress, a particular type of hat, a specific style of coat, and other details that had been mentioned in contemporary accounts of the outlaw leader. Dr. Wells printed out the enhanced images and spread them across her workstation, using a magnifying glass to examine details that even the digital enhancement couldn't fully clarify. As she studied the photographs, she began to notice something that made her blood run cold. The second figure's hand appeared to be resting on the sheriff's shoulder, but there was no corresponding indication that the sheriff was aware of this contact. The positioning suggested that the two men were standing together as companions or colleagues, yet everything Dr. Wells knew about their history indicated that they had been mortal enemies. The idea that they would pose together for a formal portrait was not just unlikely, it was historically impossible, given that one of them had been dead for 2 years when the photograph was supposedly taken. Dr. Wells decided to consult with her colleague, Dr. Robert Harrison, who specialized in 19th century photography techniques and had extensive experience in detecting and analyzing photographic manipulation from that era. She called him to her office, explaining only that she had found an unusual image that required expert analysis. When Dr. Harrison arrived and examined the photograph, his initial reaction was similar to Dr. Wells's own. He noted the exceptional technical quality of the image and the interesting composition that captured the formal dignity of frontier law enforcement. But when she directed his attention to the second figure and shared her research about the historical context, his expression changed dramatically. Dr. Harrison studied the enhanced images for several minutes before speaking. He confirmed that the anomalies Dr. Wells had observed were indeed present, and were not the result of any photographic technique or processing method known to have been available in 1889. The second figure appeared to be a genuine anomaly that defied conventional explanation. Most significantly, Dr. Harrison pointed out something that Dr. Wells had not yet noticed. The second figure appeared to be interacting with the sheriff in ways that suggested a relationship that transcended the normal boundaries between the living and the dead. The positioning of his hand, the angle of his gaze, and other subtle details suggested not just presence but active engagement with the primary subject of the photograph. Dr. Harrison suggested that they examine the museum's archives to see if any other photographs from the same time period and location existed. If they could find additional images of Sheriff Garrett or other law enforcement officials from Tombstone during the late 1880s, they might be able to determine whether the anomalous figure was isolated to this single photograph or represented a broader pattern of unusual phenomena. Their search through the museum's extensive photographic collections yielded 3 additional images from Tombstone during the same general time period. 2 showed Sheriff Garrett in different contexts, while the third captured a group of territorial officials during a formal ceremony. All 3 photographs were of excellent technical quality and showed typical frontier scenes. But when Dr. Wells and Dr. Harrison examined these additional images under magnification, they made discoveries that deepened the mystery considerably. In each photograph that featured Sheriff Garrett, the same mysterious second figure appeared. Sometimes he was positioned in the background, sometimes more prominently, but his presence was consistent across all the images. Most disturbing of all, the figure appeared to be aging and changing over the course of the photographic sequence. In the earliest image, he was barely visible, appearing almost as a shadow or suggestion of human form. But in the later photographs, he became increasingly clear and detailed, as if he were somehow gaining substance and definition through repeated photographic documentation. Dr. Wells and Dr. Harrison spent the rest of the day examining every detail of the 4 photographs, using the most advanced analytical techniques at their disposal. What they discovered challenged their understanding of both photography and historical documentation. The mysterious figure appeared to be following the normal laws of optics in every way, except for his very presence in the images. He appeared at the correct angles and proportions for his apparent position. He interacted with light and shadow in ways that suggested physical presence, and he showed appropriate perspective and depth within the photographic composition. But most unnaturally, the figure seemed to be aware of being photographed. In each image, he appeared to be looking directly at the camera, his gaze somehow penetrating through the photograph to meet the eyes of anyone who viewed the images. This awareness suggested consciousness and intent, rather than simple supernatural manifestation. As evening approached, Dr. Wells found herself alone in her office, staring at the collection of photographs spread across her desk. The mysterious figure looked back at her from each image, his presence a challenge to everything she thought she understood about the nature of historical documentation and photographic truth. She decided to research the photographer who had taken the images, hoping to find information that might shed light on the circumstances surrounding their creation. The documentation provided few clues, listing the photographer only as H. Morrison, with no additional details about their identity or background. Her search through photographic archives and historical records eventually led her to information about a photographer named Henry Morrison, who had worked throughout the Arizona Territory during the 1880s and 1890s. Morrison had been known for his skill in capturing frontier life, and his photographs were considered valuable historical documents of the American Southwest. But Dr. Wells's research also revealed something that sent chills down her spine. Morrison had disappeared in late 1889, around the same time that the final photograph in the sequence had been taken. His photographic equipment had been found in his studio in Tombstone, but Morrison himself had vanished without a trace. No body was ever found, and no explanation for his disappearance was ever discovered. Dr. Wells found herself drawn deeper into the mystery, spending hours each day researching every aspect of the photographs and the history surrounding them. She contacted other museums and historical societies, looking for additional photographs taken by Morrison or any other documentation of the events in Tombstone during that period. Her inquiries eventually led her to a private collector in Phoenix who claimed to have several other photographs taken by Morrison in the weeks before his disappearance. The collector, an elderly man named Thomas Whitfield, agreed to meet with Dr. Wells and share his collection, though he warned her that the images had always made him uncomfortable. When Dr. Wells met with Mr. Whitfield at his home, she found a man who appeared genuinely disturbed by the photographs in his possession. He explained that he had inherited them from his grandfather, who had been a contemporary of Morrison's, and had acquired the images shortly after the photographer's disappearance. Mr. Whitfield showed Dr. Wells 5 additional photographs taken by Morrison, all apparently shot in Tombstone during the same time period as the sheriff portraits. Each photograph showed the same pattern of anomalies that Dr. Wells had observed in the museum's collection. The mysterious figure appeared in various contexts and locations throughout the images, always watching, always present, but never acknowledged by the living subjects of the photographs. But these additional photographs revealed something even more disturbing. The mysterious figure appeared to be growing more solid and more influential in the later images. In Morrison's final photographs, he seemed to be actively interacting with the living subjects, though they showed no awareness of his presence. Mr. Whitfield shared one final piece of information that made Dr. Wells's blood run cold. Among Morrison's personal effects, which had been found in his studio after his disappearance, was a journal in which he had recorded his observations about the strange phenomena he had been witnessing and photographing in Tombstone. The journal entries, which Mr. Whitfield's grandfather had preserved along with the photographs, painted a picture of a photographer who had initially been excited by the opportunity to document unusual phenomena, but who had gradually become terrified by what he was witnessing. Morrison's final entries described his growing conviction that the mysterious figure was not simply a supernatural manifestation, but was somehow using the photographic process to gain influence over the living world. According to Morrison's journal, the figure seemed to become more solid and more capable of affecting physical events with each photograph he took. He wrote about objects moving in his studio, voices speaking to him when he was alone, and a growing sense that he was being watched and followed by something that existed on the boundary between life and death. Morrison's final entry, dated just days before his disappearance, expressed his intention to stop photographing in Tombstone and leave the territory immediately. He wrote that he had come to believe that his photographic work was somehow feeding the mysterious entity, giving it the energy and substance it needed to manifest more fully in the physical world. Dr. Wells read Morrison's journal with growing unease, recognizing parallels between his experiences and her own growing obsession with the mysterious photographs. Like Morrison, she found herself spending more and more time studying the images, enhancing and analyzing every detail in an attempt to understand what she was seeing. And like Morrison, she had begun to notice strange occurrences in her own life that seemed connected to her research. She started seeing figures in her peripheral vision, shadowy forms that vanished when she turned to look at them directly. She heard footsteps in empty corridors of the museum, sounds that had no apparent source. Most disturbing of all, Dr. Wells began to see the mysterious figure from the photographs appearing in her daily life. She glimpsed him in reflections in windows and even in the screens of electronic devices, always watching her with that same intense gaze that had first caught her attention in the sheriff's portrait. Dr. Wells tried to convince herself that these experiences were simply the result of stress and overwork, the natural consequence of spending too much time focused on disturbing historical materials. But the experiences became more frequent and more vivid as she continued her research, suggesting that something more than psychological stress might be involved. She decided to consult with Dr. Maria Santos, a colleague who specialized in the psychological effects of intensive historical research. Dr. Santos had studied cases where researchers had become so absorbed in their work that they began to experience symptoms similar to those described by the subjects of their research. Dr. Santos listened to Dr. Wells's account with interest and concern, explaining that she had encountered similar cases in her own work. According to Santos, there were documented instances where researchers studying traumatic historical events had begun to experience psychological symptoms that mirrored those of the people they were studying. The phenomenon was thought to work through a kind of psychological resonance, where the researchers' intense focus on disturbing material created a bridge between their own mental state and the experiences of historical subjects. In extreme cases, researchers had reported experiencing hallucinations and other symptoms that seemed to recreate the experiences of people who had lived decades or even centuries earlier. Dr. Santos suggested that Dr. Wells might be experiencing what researchers in her field called sympathetic manifestation, a phenomenon where someone who studied supernatural or unexplained events too closely could begin to experience similar phenomena in their own life. She advised Dr. Wells to take a break from her research and to distance herself from the Morrison photographs as much as possible, but Dr. Wells found herself unable to follow this advice. Despite her growing fear and the increasingly disturbing experiences she was having, she felt compelled to continue her research, driven by a need to understand what Morrison had discovered and what had ultimately happened to him. She returned to her office and began an even more intensive analysis of the photographs, using advanced digital techniques to enhance every detail of the mysterious figure's appearance. As she worked, she began to notice additional anomalies that she had previously missed. The mysterious figure appeared to be aging and changing, not just across the sequence of photographs, but within individual images as well. In some areas of a single photograph, he appeared younger and less distinct, while in other areas he seemed older and more solid, as if he were somehow existing at multiple points in time simultaneously. More disturbing still, Dr. Wells began to see her own reflection appearing in the enhanced images. At first, she dismissed this as a processing artifact or a trick of the light, but as she continued her analysis, she realized that her reflection was appearing in photographs taken over a century before her birth. The appearance of her own image in the historical photographs was impossible to explain through any rational means. Yet there she was, clearly visible in the enhanced images, standing among the historical figures as if she belonged in their time period. In some images, she appeared to be interacting with the mysterious figure, as if they were engaged in some kind of communication across the boundaries of time. Dr. Wells stared at the impossible images in shock and disbelief. How could her reflection appear in photographs taken decades before she was born? The rational part of her mind insisted that she must be seeing patterns in random visual noise, that her intensive study of the photographs was causing her to project her own image onto ambiguous shapes in the pictures. But the images were too clear, too detailed, to be explained by imagination or wishful thinking. They showed not just her general appearance, but specific details that were unique to her, including a distinctive piece of jewelry that she wore daily and a scar on her hand that she had acquired in childhood. As Dr. Wells continued to stare at the enhanced images, she began to understand what Morrison had realized in his final days in Tombstone. The photographs were not simply documenting supernatural events that had occurred in the past. They were somehow creating a connection between past and present, allowing the mysterious figure to reach across time and claim new victims. By studying the photographs so intensively, Dr. Wells had somehow inserted herself into the supernatural narrative of Tombstone. She had become part of the story that Morrison had been documenting, another victim of the entity that existed in the spaces between life and death. Dr. Wells tried to stop her research, to put the photographs away and forget about the mystery of the sheriff and his impossible companion. But she found that she could not. Every time she tried to focus on other work, her attention was drawn back to Morrison's images. She felt compelled to continue enhancing and analyzing them, even though she now understood that doing so was somehow sealing her own fate. The supernatural experiences in her daily life intensified dramatically. She began to see the mysterious figure from the photographs in her own environment, standing in the corridors of the museum, appearing in reflections, and watching her from the shadows of her own home. Most terrifying of all, she began to see Sheriff Garrett himself, the primary subject of Morrison's photographs. He appeared to her exactly as he had in the historical images, wearing his badge and uniform, but his expression had changed from the stern dignity of the original portraits to something that suggested fear and desperation. Dr. Wells realized that she was experiencing the same progression of events that had claimed Morrison over a century ago. The mysterious figure was gradually drawing her into his realm, using her own research and curiosity as the mechanism for her recruitment. She tried to seek help from Dr. Santos and other colleagues, but found that she could not adequately explain what was happening to her without sounding delusional. The supernatural experiences were intensely personal and subjective, impossible to document or verify through conventional means. As her situation deteriorated, Dr. Wells began to understand that she had only one option remaining. She would have to find a way to break the connection between herself and the mysterious figure, even if it meant destroying Morrison's photographs and all the research she had conducted. But when she attempted to destroy the images, she found that they seemed to resist her efforts. Digital files that she deleted reappeared on her computer. Physical photographs that she tried to damage remained unharmed. The mysterious figure had apparently grown strong enough to protect his means of influence in the modern world. Dr. Wells's research had revealed that the supernatural activity surrounding the photographs was not random or chaotic, but followed specific patterns and rules. The mysterious figure appeared to be bound by certain limitations, unable to exist fully in the physical world, but capable of influencing it through photographic documentation and the obsession of those who studied his image. She began to study these patterns more carefully, hoping to find some weakness or vulnerability that she could exploit. Her analysis revealed that the figure seemed to be strongest when he was being actively observed or documented, but weakened when he was ignored or forgotten. This discovery led Dr. Wells to develop a new strategy. Instead of trying to destroy the photographs, she would work to limit their influence by ensuring that they were never again subjected to the kind of intensive study that had awakened the mysterious figure. She would hide them away, bury them in the archives where they would be forgotten and ignored. But as she prepared to implement this plan, Dr. Wells made another disturbing discovery. The mysterious figure was not confined to Morrison's original photographs. He had somehow spread to other images in the museum's collection, infecting them with the same anomalous properties that characterized the tombstone pictures. Dr. Wells found the figure appearing in photographs that had previously shown nothing unusual. Images of other frontier towns began to show the same supernatural presence that had marked Morrison's work. The mysterious figure was spreading through the archive like a contagion, claiming more and more of the historical record. She realized that her efforts to study and understand the phenomenon had inadvertently helped it to spread. By enhancing and analyzing the original photographs, she had somehow strengthened the mysterious figure and given him the power to extend his influence beyond his original boundaries. Dr. Wells began to understand that she was facing something far more dangerous than a simple haunting. The mysterious figure was not just seeking to claim individual victims, but was working to corrupt the entire photographic record, to insert himself into humanity's visual memory and become a permanent part of the documented past. The implications were staggering. If the mysterious figure succeeded in his apparent goal, he could potentially rewrite visual history itself, creating false images and fictional events that would become accepted as historical fact. The boundary between reality and supernatural fiction would become blurred beyond recognition. Dr. Wells realized that she had become the unwitting agent of this corruption, her research serving as the mechanism by which the mysterious figure spread his influence. Every photograph she enhanced, every detail she analyzed, every pattern she identified, all contributed to the growing power of the entity that had once been William Blackwood. She tried to warn her colleagues about the danger, but found that they were unable to see the anomalies that had become so obvious to her. The supernatural influence seemed to be selective, affecting only those who studied the images with sufficient intensity and focus. Her warnings were dismissed as the products of stress and overwork. Dr. Wells found herself increasingly isolated, the only person who could see the growing corruption of the photographic record. She watched helplessly as more and more images in the collection began to show signs of supernatural influence, their original subjects gradually being joined by the mysterious figure from the tombstone photographs. The mysterious figure seemed to be using her own expertise against her, exploiting her knowledge of photographic analysis and historical research to spread his influence more effectively. He had learned from her methods, adapting his techniques to match her analytical approaches. Dr. Wells began to realize that her only hope lay in finding some way to reverse the process she had inadvertently started. She would need to find a method of removing the supernatural influence from the photographs, of restoring them to their original, uncontaminated state. Her research led her to explore various theories about the nature of photographic images and their relationship to reality. She studied the work of early photographers who had reported supernatural phenomena in their images, looking for clues about how such influences might be countered or removed. Dr. Wells discovered that several 19th-century photographers had developed techniques for what they called spiritual cleansing of photographic images, methods that were supposed to remove unwanted supernatural influences from pictures. These techniques had been dismissed by mainstream photography as superstition, but Dr. Wells began to wonder if they might contain some element of truth. She experimented with various approaches, trying to find some way to restore the corrupted photographs to their original state. Some methods seemed to have temporary effects, causing the mysterious figure to fade or become less distinct, but the supernatural influence always returned, often stronger than before. Dr. Wells's experiments revealed that the mysterious figure was not simply a passive imprint left by traumatic events, but an active, intelligent entity that could adapt and respond to attempts to remove him. He seemed to learn from each effort to cleanse the photographs, developing new methods of resistance and infiltration. As her research continued, Dr. Wells began to notice that the supernatural influence was not confined to the photographs themselves, but was beginning to affect the physical environment of the museum. She started seeing the mysterious figure in the archive rooms, hearing voices and footsteps in empty corridors, and experiencing temperature drops and electrical disturbances that had no apparent cause. The building itself seemed to be becoming a conduit for the supernatural entity, allowing him to manifest in the physical world rather than being confined to photographic images. Dr. Wells realized that her intensive study of the corrupted photographs had somehow created a bridge between the supernatural realm and physical reality. She tried to limit her exposure to the affected photographs, but found that the supernatural influence had grown too strong to be easily avoided. The mysterious figure now appeared to her regularly, both in the museum and in her daily life outside the institution. During this period of escalating supernatural activity, Dr. Wells began to notice that the manifestations followed certain patterns that seemed to correspond to lunar cycles and other celestial events. The mysterious figure appeared more frequently and with greater clarity during certain phases of the moon, suggesting that his ability to manifest in the physical world was somehow tied to natural astronomical phenomena. This discovery led Dr. Wells to research the astronomical conditions that had existed during the original confrontation between Sheriff Garrett and William Blackwood. She found that their final battle had occurred during a rare celestial alignment, when several planets were in conjunction and a lunar eclipse was visible from the Arizona Territory. Dr. Wells began to theorize that the mysterious figure was not simply a random supernatural phenomenon, but was connected to specific cosmic events that created favorable conditions for his manifestation. The violent nature of Blackwood's death, combined with the celestial alignment that had occurred at the time, had somehow allowed his spirit to linger in the physical world rather than passing on to whatever realm awaited him beyond death. This understanding led Dr. Wells to develop a new approach to dealing with the supernatural entity. Instead of trying to fight him directly, she would work to predict and prepare for the times when he would be strongest, and use the periods of weakness to implement countermeasures. Dr. Wells's research revealed that the next major celestial alignment would occur in just a few weeks, creating conditions that would likely strengthen the mysterious figure dramatically. She realized that this event might represent her last opportunity to break free from his influence before he became too powerful to resist. She began preparing for what she knew would be a final confrontation with the entity that had once been William Blackwood. Using her knowledge of his patterns and weaknesses, she developed a plan that she hoped would either free her from his influence or at least prevent him from spreading his corruption further. Dr. Wells's plan involved using the mysterious figure's own methods against him. Just as he had used photographic documentation to spread his influence, she would use similar techniques to contain and redirect his power. She would create a comprehensive photographic record of his manifestations, but instead of enhancing and analyzing the images, she would deliberately distort and corrupt them, breaking the connection between the supernatural entity and his visual representations. The process would be dangerous, requiring her to expose herself to the full power of the mysterious figure during his period of greatest strength. But Dr. Wells believed it was her only chance to prevent the entity from achieving his apparent goal of corrupting the entire photographic record. As the celestial alignment approached, Dr. Wells began to notice increased supernatural activity throughout the museum building. The mysterious figure appeared more frequently and with greater clarity, and the temperature drops and electrical disturbances became more severe. The building itself seemed to be responding to the approaching cosmic event, as if it were somehow attuned to the same forces that had originally allowed Blackwood's spirit to linger in the physical world. Dr. Wells's colleagues began to notice the strange occurrences as well, though they attributed them to equipment malfunctions and environmental factors. Several staff members reported seeing shadowy figures in the corridors, and the building's security system began registering unexplained motion detector activations and door openings. The night of the celestial alignment, Dr. Wells remained in the archives after the museum had been closed to the public. She had prepared her equipment and positioned herself in the room where Morrison's photographs were stored, ready to implement her plan when the mysterious figure reached his peak strength. As the alignment reached its maximum point, the supernatural manifestations intensified dramatically. The mysterious figure appeared throughout the archive room, no longer confined to photographic images, but manifesting as a semi-solid apparition that moved freely through the physical space. William Blackwood materialized directly in front of Dr. Wells, his form more solid and substantial than she had ever seen it before. For the first time since she had begun seeing him, the supernatural entity spoke, his voice carrying the hollow echo of someone speaking from beyond the grave. He told Dr. Wells that she had been chosen to serve as his agent in the modern world, that her research and expertise made her uniquely qualified to help him achieve his goal of permanent manifestation in the physical realm. He explained that his death at the hands of Sheriff Garrett had been unjust, that he had been denied the opportunity to complete his earthly business, and that he was now seeking to rectify that injustice through any means necessary. Dr. Wells listened to Blackwood's words with a mixture of fascination and terror, understanding for the first time the true scope of what she was facing. The mysterious figure was not simply seeking revenge against Sheriff Garrett, who had long since passed away, but was working to corrupt the entire historical record, to rewrite the past in a way that would vindicate his actions and justify his continued existence. Blackwood offered Dr. Wells a choice. She could join him willingly and help him achieve his goal, or she could resist and face the same fate as Morrison and countless others who had opposed him throughout the decades. He explained that her research had already made her partially connected to his realm, and that it would be a simple matter to complete the transformation and bring her fully under his influence. Dr. Wells realized that this was the moment she had been preparing for, the final test of her plan to break free from the supernatural entity's influence. She activated her equipment and began the process she had designed, using her photographic techniques to create distorted and corrupted images of Blackwood's manifestation. The effect was immediate and dramatic. As Dr. Wells captured and distorted the images of the supernatural entity, he began to lose coherence and stability. His form flickered and wavered, becoming less distinct and less threatening with each corrupted image she created. Blackwood reacted with surprise and anger, realizing that Dr. Wells was using his own methods against him. He attempted to stop her, but found that his ability to interact with the physical world was being weakened by her photographic interference. Dr. Wells continued her work, systematically documenting and corrupting Blackwood's manifestation throughout the archive room. With each distorted image she created, the supernatural entity became less solid and less influential, his connection to the physical world gradually being severed. But the process was taking a toll on Dr. Wells as well. The intense exposure to supernatural forces during their period of peak strength was affecting her both physically and mentally. She began to feel disoriented and disconnected from reality, as if she were being pulled between two different worlds. As the celestial alignment reached its conclusion, Blackwood's power began to weaken naturally. Combined with the effects of Dr. Wells's photographic interference, this created a window of opportunity for her to complete her plan and break free from his influence. With a final burst of effort, Dr. Wells created one last distorted image that seemed to shatter the connection between the supernatural entity and the physical world. Blackwood's form vanished abruptly, and the oppressive atmosphere that had filled the archive room lifted like a weight being removed from her shoulders. Dr. Wells collapsed from exhaustion, but she had succeeded in her goal. The supernatural entity that had once been William Blackwood had been driven back to whatever realm he had emerged from, and his influence over the museum's collection had been broken. However, Dr. Wells's victory came at a significant personal cost. The intense exposure to supernatural forces had left her permanently changed, her perception of reality forever altered by her experience. She found that she could still see traces of the supernatural world overlapping with the physical realm, though the threatening presence of Blackwood had been eliminated. In the weeks following the confrontation, Dr. Wells worked to document her experience and develop protocols for preventing similar supernatural infiltrations in the future. She collaborated with Dr. Santos and other researchers to create a network of institutions that could identify and contain dangerous historical materials before they could spread their influence. Dr. Wells's research revealed that the phenomenon she had encountered was not unique to Tombstone. Similar supernatural infiltrations had occurred at archives and museums around the world, often triggered by intensive study of traumatic historical events that had left psychic imprints on physical objects. The network developed by Dr. Wells and her colleagues began to identify patterns in these supernatural manifestations, creating early warning systems that could detect the presence of dangerous materials before they could affect researchers. They also developed techniques for safely studying such materials without triggering supernatural activity. Despite these precautions, new cases continued to emerge regularly. The boundary between the documented past and the supernatural realm seemed to be inherently unstable, requiring constant vigilance to maintain. Dr. Wells found herself at the center of a growing community of researchers who worked quietly to protect the integrity of the historical record from supernatural corruption. The Morrison photographs remained in the Arizona State Historical Museum's collection, but they were now stored in a specially designed containment system that prevented them from manifesting supernatural activity. The images could still be studied, but only under carefully controlled conditions that limited exposure and prevented the kind of intensive analysis that had originally awakened Blackwood's spirit. Dr. Wells continued her work as a historical archivist, but her role had expanded to include supernatural threat assessment and containment. She became one of the leading experts in identifying and neutralizing dangerous historical materials, her experience with the Blackwood entity serving as the foundation for new protocols and procedures. The mysterious figure from the sheriff's portrait had been contained, but his image remained as a reminder of the dangers that lurked within the photographic record. Dr. Wells kept a copy of the original portrait in her office, not as a trophy of her victory, but as a warning of what could happen when the boundaries between past and present became too thin. The photograph showed Sheriff Garrett standing alone now, the mysterious figure having been erased from the image through Dr. Wells's intervention. But sometimes when the light hit the photograph at just the right angle, observers could still make out a faint shadow where Blackwood had once stood, a reminder that some stains on history were not easily removed. Dr. Wells's research had also revealed disturbing information about the original confrontation between Sheriff Garrett and William Blackwood. According to documents she had uncovered in the territorial archives, the circumstances surrounding Blackwood's death had been more complex than the official reports had indicated. Garrett had indeed cornered Blackwood and his gang in the remote canyon, but the confrontation had not been the clear-cut victory that history had recorded. Blackwood had been wounded, but not killed in the initial exchange of gunfire, and he had attempted to surrender to Garrett. However, for reasons that were never fully explained, Garrett had chosen to execute the wounded outlaw rather than take him prisoner. This revelation cast Blackwood's supernatural persistence in a new light. His refusal to accept death and move on to whatever realm awaited him was not simply the result of criminal arrogance, but was rooted in a genuine injustice that had been covered up by the territorial authorities. Garrett's reputation as a hero had been built on a lie, and Blackwood's spirit had been seeking to expose that truth for over a century. Dr. Wells found herself in the uncomfortable position of understanding Blackwood's motivations while still recognizing the danger he posed to the living world. His quest for justice had become twisted by decades of supernatural existence, transforming him into something that threatened the very fabric of historical truth. The network of researchers that Dr. Wells had helped establish began to encounter similar cases around the world, instances where historical injustices had created supernatural entities that sought to rewrite the past. These entities posed a unique challenge, as they were often motivated by legitimate grievances that had been suppressed or forgotten by conventional history. Dr. Wells developed new protocols for dealing with such entities, approaches that acknowledged their grievances while still protecting the integrity of the historical record. In some cases, this involved researching and publicizing the true facts of historical events, allowing the supernatural entities to find peace through the restoration of truth. In other cases, more direct intervention was required to prevent the entities from corrupting the documented past. The work was emotionally demanding, requiring Dr. Wells and her colleagues to confront the uncomfortable reality that much of recorded history was incomplete or deliberately distorted. They found themselves serving not just as archivists and researchers, but as mediators between the living and the dead, working to resolve conflicts that had persisted across the centuries. Dr. Wells's final journal entries, discovered weeks later by concerned colleagues, described her growing realization that she had become trapped in the same supernatural web that had claimed Morrison and countless others throughout history. She wrote about her intention to travel to Tombstone, hoping to find some way to break the connection or at least understand what had really happened there. She theorized that the mysterious figure might be weaker at his point of origin, that the physical location where the original confrontation between Sheriff Garrett and William Blackwood had taken place might hold some key to understanding and potentially defeating him. Her plan was to visit the site of their final battle and attempt to perform some kind of ritual that might break the connection between the supernatural entity and the photographic images. Dr. Wells's research had revealed that the canyon where Blackwood had met his end had been considered sacred by local Native American tribes, a place where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was naturally thin. The violent nature of Blackwood's death, combined with his refusal to accept defeat even in death, had somehow allowed him to linger in that liminal space, using photographic documentation as a means of extending his influence into the world of the living. She believed that the key to stopping the supernatural influence lay in somehow convincing Blackwood's spirit to accept his fate and move on to whatever realm awaited him beyond death. Her plan was to perform a ritual based on Native American traditions, hoping to guide the troubled spirit to its proper rest. Dr. Catherine Wells was reported missing 3 days after her final journal entry. Her car was found abandoned on a remote road outside of Tombstone, near the canyon where the historical confrontation between Sheriff Garrett and William Blackwood had taken place. Despite extensive searches by local authorities, no trace of her was ever found. The photographs that had started her investigation remained in the archives of the Arizona State Historical Museum, filed away in a restricted collection that required special permission to access. The official records listed them as historically significant but potentially disturbing, requiring careful handling by qualified researchers. But sometimes late at night, when the museum was empty, security guards reported seeing lights in the archive rooms where Morrison's photographs were stored. When they investigated, they found nothing unusual, just the quiet rows of climate-controlled storage units that held the state's photographic heritage. The sheriff's portrait remained exactly as Dr. Wells had left it, enhanced and analyzed down to the smallest detail. The mysterious figure continued to stand beside Sheriff Garrett, his presence a testament to the power of unfinished business and the refusal to accept the finality of death. And in the enhanced images that Dr. Wells had created, careful observers could now make out additional figures among the supernatural forms. Morrison was there, his camera still visible in his hands. Dr. Wells stood nearby, wearing the same clothes she had been wearing when she disappeared. Both appeared to be watching, waiting for someone else to discover their story and become part of it. The mystery of the sheriff's portrait remained unsolved, but it was no longer a historical puzzle. It had become an active supernatural force, using the very human desire to understand and document the past as a means of claiming new victims across the centuries. The mysterious figure still stood beside Sheriff Garrett, and he would continue to stand there, patient and eternal, until someone else was curious enough to look too closely at his impossible presence in a photograph that should have captured nothing more than a moment of frontier law enforcement. The truth about what had happened in Tombstone remained hidden in the shadows of the past, protected by an entity that had learned to use human curiosity and the permanence of photographic documentation as weapons against the living. Some mysteries, it seemed, were better left unsolved, and some photographs were better left unexamined. But the images remained in their archive, waiting for the next researcher, who would be unable to resist the challenge of explaining the impossible, the next victim who would discover too late that some historical documents were not meant to be preserved, but to preserve those who studied them too closely. The mysterious figure watched and waited from his position beside the sheriff, ready to welcome the next curious soul who would look too closely at his impossible presence in a photograph that had become a doorway between worlds, a gateway that remained forever open, forever hungry for new victims to add to its supernatural collection. Years passed, and the restricted collection remained largely undisturbed. The Arizona State Historical Museum had implemented new protocols for handling potentially dangerous historical materials, though the official explanations focused on preservation concerns rather than supernatural threats. Only a few senior staff members knew the true reason why certain photographs required special handling and limited access. The Morrison photographs remained the most dangerous items in the museum's collection, but they were no longer unique. Similar materials had been identified in archives and institutions around the world, each carrying its own supernatural influence and posing its own unique threats to those who studied them too closely. The mysterious figure from the sheriff's portrait had become something of a legend among those who knew about such things, a cautionary tale about the dangers of delving too deeply into certain historical mysteries. His image served as a reminder that some aspects of the past were better left undisturbed, that not all historical questions were meant to be answered, but the human desire to understand and document the past remained as strong as ever, and new researchers continued to be drawn to the mysteries hidden in historical photographs. The supernatural entity that had claimed Morrison, Dr. Wells and countless others waited patiently for his next victims, knowing that curiosity and the pursuit of knowledge would eventually bring new prey within his reach. The sheriff's portrait remained in its restricted file, the mysterious figure still standing beside Sheriff Garrett, with his knowing gaze and timeless presence. In the space around them, the supernatural realm continued to grow, adding new figures as more researchers fell victim to the entity they had tried to study and understand. The mystery of Tombstone had become something far more dangerous than a historical puzzle. It had evolved into a supernatural trap that used humanity's own desire for knowledge and understanding as bait, claiming new victims across the decades and adding them to its ever-growing collection of the lost and the forgotten. And somewhere in the desert outside of Tombstone, in a canyon that no longer appeared on any map, the site of the original confrontation waited in the shadows, a physical anchor for a supernatural entity that had learned to exist in the space between life and death, between the documented and the real, between justice and vengeance. The mysterious figure would continue his eternal vigil, watching and waiting from his position beside the sheriff, ready to welcome the next curious soul who would look too closely at his impossible presence in a photograph that had become a doorway between worlds, a gateway that remained forever open, forever hungry for new victims to add to its supernatural collection. In the depths of the museum's archives, the Morrison collection waited in its climate-controlled storage, each photograph a potential trap for the unwary researcher. The mysterious figure's dark clothing continued to appear crisp and timeless, a beacon calling out to those who sought to understand the mysteries of the past, promising answers but delivering only eternal servitude in a realm where the boundaries between law and lawlessness, between life and death, had been forever blurred. The story of Sheriff Garrett and his impossible companion had become a living thing, growing stronger with each telling, each investigation, each attempt to understand its impossible truths, and the mysterious figure stood ready to welcome all who would join him in his eternal watch, adding their voices to the chorus of the lost and the forgotten, the researchers and photographers who had looked too deeply into the shadows of the past and found themselves trapped there forever. The legacy of Dr. Catherine Wells lived on in the protocols and procedures she had helped develop, the network of researchers who continued her work of identifying and containing supernatural threats within historical collections. Her sacrifice had not been in vain, as her methods had prevented countless other researchers from falling victim to similar supernatural traps. But the work was never finished, the vigilance never complete. New threats emerged regularly, new mysteries presented themselves to curious minds, and new victims were claimed by forces that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human understanding. The mysterious figure from the sheriff's portrait remained as a reminder that some doors once opened could never be fully closed, and some mysteries were better left forever unsolved. The photographic record continued to serve as a bridge between past and present, between the living and the dead, between truth and fiction. And in that liminal space, entities like William Blackwood waited with infinite patience, knowing that human curiosity would eventually bring them new companions to share their eternal vigil in the shadows between worlds.